Hey there, today I am going to be benchmarking the Intel i5-430M. This i5 was released in 2010 and it has 2 cores, 4 threads, and it has a turbo up to 2.5 GHz and a base speed of 2.2 GHz. And I'm pairing this laptop with 4 GB of DDR3 RAM running at 1066 MHz, as well as the Intel iGPU that comes with this CPU. And the laptop this is in is the Gateway NV55C, which I've made 2 previous videos on. Without further ado, let's get into the benchmarks. The first game up on the list is BioShock Infinite, and at 480p on the very low settings, the game was getting roughly 15 frames per second, and it was freezing completely. The frame rate wasn't necessarily bad, but the game would just pause, and it would say it's loading, and then it would unpause and just continue on like nothing happened. It is a very similar thing to what I've seen in a game called Spider-Man Remastered on some older graphics cards. Either way, at 480p, the game is really unplayable. It's just a really bad experience. So at 240p on the very low settings, the game was still having a really bad time, so the average frame rate was 16, and the 1% low was 1 frames per second, or I should say frame, not frames, because 1 is a frame. One way or another, yeah, it's really unplayable, and it was still going over and saying loading when you were trying to move to another area. I've not seen this before with any other CPU or graphics card. And the weirdness is, the graphics card wasn't even maxed out at 240p, so this might be CPU related in this case, I'm not sure. So that's interesting. BattleBit Remastered at 720p on the very low settings was running at roughly 15 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 1. Depending where you are on the map, you could actually reach 20 frames per second, which is amazing. Not really. Especially because this is the Potato preset, or the very low settings. I don't know what the difference between Potato and very low would technically be, but there's not any setting called very low, it's just called Potato. Yeah, but Potato isn't making this Potato run this game good, so Potato mode is doing a bad job. This isn't sounding as funny as it is intended to be. Fall Guys at 720p on the low settings, which 720p is the lowest resolution the game supports, the game was getting a whopping 5 frames per second. It almost seemed like the frame rate was capped at 5, but no, it wasn't. It was just getting 5 frames per second. Yeah, I think this was worse than the i3 in the last video. This is impressively bad, especially for Fall Guys. Fall Guys isn't really a hard game to run at all, and yet it's taken this old i5 Intel iGPU to its knees. Literally. That's fine. Portal at 720p on the very low settings was running at roughly 30 frames per second on average, and the 1% lows were not very good either, they were around 9. And to add to that, the game was dropping below 30 frames per second regularly. Yeah, and this is a game from 2007. 3 years older than the CPU. This is impressively bad. To be fair, the Intel iGPU was never intended for gaming, but still though, this is very not good for such an old game. Roblox Arsenal at 800 by 600 resolution on the lowest possible settings, the game was running at roughly 30 frames per second on average. Though, it was a easy map to run for 1, and for 2, it was dropping below 30 frames per second regularly. So if you were playing a more intensive map, the game would probably barely be breaking 20 frames per second. So, also, not a very good experience at all. Nope. On Minecraft Java Edition, I was playing 1.16 again because this iGPU doesn't support any version of Minecraft Java Edition newer than 1.16, and I was using the Optifine mod, and the game was getting roughly 30 frames per second at 1366x768 resolution, and this was on the very low settings with a 2-chunk render distance, so basically extremely low settings. So that is not very good. 30 frames per second with these settings is actually quite bad. I should also add the 1% lows were around 15 as well, so all in all, not very good. I also tried the Sodium mod, and it was only getting around 25 frames per second, so worse than Optifine. I also tried Minecraft Bedrock at 1366x768 resolution on the lowest settings, meaning the lowest settings and the lowest render distance, which is 5 chunks, and it wasn't running very well. It was often dipping below 30 frames per second, and the 1% loads were around 13. This actually ran worse than the i3 370M CPU I tested in the last video. That was getting about 50 frames per second. I'm not sure why this was running so badly, but it was. So, yeah, that's something. Either way, the game is still playable like this. It's just not ideal, to say the least. The weird part is, it doesn't matter if I'm loading in chunks extremely quickly or standing in one spot, the frame rate stays the same. Now for the games that did not open. BeamNG Drive and Rocket League did not open. The reason why is the iGPU on this CPU is missing the specific instructions required to open the games, which, if I'm not mistaken, it's OpenGL of some sort, like modern OpenGL version. So, one way or another, those games just refused to open. I thought for sure Rocket League would open, but nope, it didn't, it just crashed. So, the conclusion. Do I recommend you to go out and buy a Intel i5 430M and just use the iGPU for gaming? No, I don't. Did you see the performance here? Yeah, the performance is really bad. Don't buy this for gaming, but for general office usage, this CPU will be just fine. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again next time. Also, I should add, if you could leave a like or subscribe, that would be amazing, but you don't have to. See ya!